call it the silly season for obvious reasons. But this year it's even become sillier. Right now, there are at least 26 families in Connecticut, USA, burying either a child or an adult, a teacher, slaughtered by obviously strange young man who took a deadly weapon into a school, into the classroom which his mother taught in, and shot 20 of the children that she taught after he had shot his mother in the face. And of course, America's in uproar at the moment. President Obama has said that he wants to do the impossible, and the impossible is to take guns away from Americans. That's not going to happen until Christ comes. And when he does come, he'll take all their weapons away. There'll be greater carnage, of course, but it won't be improper. It will not be unjust. It will not be of the nature that we saw this week. The world in which we live is in a very terrible state, is it not, brothers and sisters? But I can tell you President Obama has a lot more on his mind than trying to sort out the gun lobby. The nation is facing what they call the fiscal cliff. What that means is that certain things will happen automatically, can't be changed by government. Automatically, beginning of January, certain things are going to happen. Tax rates will be affected, all sorts of things will be affected. And unless they do something to raise the power to borrow, which they're not allowed to do, then America is going to be in deep trouble. Do yourself a favour. If you do get into YouTube, instead of looking at nonsense, type in some sensible things like financial collapse 2013, depression 2013. I did that. It'll take you about an hour to get through the stuff that comes up, and a lot of it is pretty sound stuff. The Bretton Woods financial system that the world's been using since 1944 will probably fall over, deliberately pushed over, next year, 2013. It does look as though the long forecast depression, which I've been talking about, as you know, for a long time, is about to come. So when it comes, it's going to pitch this world into a position that it's never known before. The chaos, the dislocation, the unemployment. It's already 25% in Spain. It was only 25% in America in the Depression of 1930. 25% already in Spain. It's going to be double that in Spain. There will be a depression. But you and I know that we must be taken from times of prosperity, general prosperity. And if you go down to the shopping centres right now, you'll know that even though, of course, the traders are complaining about the lack of spending this Christmas compared to previous ones, it's still pretty busy down there, isn't it? Very busy. We're living in a world that has general prosperity, and people are buying and selling and building and planting. You don't do those things in depressions. So we, brothers and sisters, I believe, will be taken away before it comes. So you do your own homework on that. Have a look at Luke chapter 17. Just ponder the last dozen or so verses of that chapter and see if you come to the same conclusion that I do. We and the world are running out of time. And we're about to see the reality of the things we're going to talk about tonight in 2 Chronicles 26. 2 Chronicles 26 is all about Uzziah, the king of Judah. We call him the leprous king because that's how he died. You recall the last verse or so of the chapter we read? The leprous king. He died with leprosy. It appears as though he made no changes to his spiritual state right up to the end. Therefore, it does appear as though Uzziah is doomed at the judgment seat of Christ. We'll have to wait and see about that, but that's the way the record reads. But he's a very interesting king. You might say, well, what has Uzziah got to do with Jehoiada the priest? Is this just padding you've put on this study, just to fill it out a bit? No. You're going to see it's got everything to do with it. You're going to see Uzziah did something pretty terrible. He went in to the holy place of the temple to take the place of the high priest of Judah. A man, by the way, who bore the same name, as we're going to see. And he tried to become a king priest. Now, why did he do that? What was the motivation that would drive a man? He was clearly a sensible man, certainly dynamic, certainly very successful. Why would a sensible man do something idiotic like that? Well, because you see, this man knew that both his father and his grandfather were not buried amongst the kings of Judah. They were buried in the field of burial. Right at the end of 2 Chronicles 26, you see this, verse 23. They buried him with his fathers in the field of the burial. Now that means that he was not buried amongst the sepulchres of the kings, but somewhere out to the side of it. That's where Uzziah's grandfather had been buried. And Uzziah knew that Jehoiada the priest was buried among the kings. He had a privilege. He was buried. He wasn't a king. He was a high priest. But he was buried among the kings because effectively he had been both a king and a priest. He had ruled the nation in the early years of Joash. He was the one that put Joash on the throne. He was the one that got rid of Athaliah and all of the Baal worship that she'd introduced. So, brothers and sisters, this man Uzziah, who went through 40-something years of prosperity and of incredible achievements, pondered that. Wow, why was Jehoiada the priest put amongst the kings and my father and my grandfather weren't? He realised that there was something about Jehoiada that was unique, and he wanted to be like him. In fact, he wanted to even go further than that. He wanted to be the Messiah of Israel. And he thought at the end of 40 years of unmitigated success that Messiah couldn't possibly do any more than what Uzziah, king of Judah, had done. So he had a right, a title to the priesthood as well as the kingship. That's why I believe he went in with his pretension to seize hold of that role as well as the role of the king. So we want to have a look at this man. Now, just a couple of things from this slide. His name means the strength of Yah, but I want you to notice something. He was also known as Azariah. If you go to the record of the kings, that's the name given to him, Azariah. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because it just so happens that the high priest that he intends to displace was named Azariah. Why not just get one Azariah and say, right, you disappear into the shadows, and another Azariah, who happens to be the king, will become the high priest as well. Looks pretty simple, doesn't it? And that's what he did. But I want you to notice too, these two passages. Now we're going to come to Zechariah 14 verse 5, which is the last mention of the name Uzziah in the Old Testament. And I just want to remind you of the only mention of Uzziah in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 9. Do you recall how we looked at 4 forgotten rulers in our second study? And we saw that 3 kings of Judah and Athaliah, all of whom assumed the throne in the history of Judah, were left out of the genealogy of Joseph, the alleged father of Christ, as it was thought. Left out of that genealogy of David. Why? Well, we saw the reasons why in that study. So it went from Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, to Uzziah. And those 3 kings in the middle just disappeared from the record. And we saw that the 3 who disappeared, along with Athaliah, of course, were all idolaters. They served false gods. And that's why God expunged them from the genealogy of David. So brothers and sisters and young people, when we come to this man, he is intimately connected with all that we've considered in the life of Jehoiada the priest. In this man's reign, a number of kings ruled in the north. The most significant of those was a man called Jeroboam II. Now, he was the third in the line of Jehu. God had promised Jehu 4 generations on the throne of Israel. He kept that promise, and to keep it, he had to give Israel a period of peace because they were in serious trouble from the Syrians to the north, as we'll just see in a moment a map. But before we go to that map, there's these significant references about Uzziah. He's mentioned in Hosea 1 verse 1, Amos 1 verse 1. Of course, these are prophets who prophesied in that period. As I said, Zechariah 14 verse 5, very important in the scheme of things. Isaiah 1 verse 1, because Isaiah was prophesying in his reign as well. Chapter 6 of Isaiah in verse 1, perhaps the most important of them all. We're going to have a look at Isaiah 6 verse 1 a little later on. Because in that verse we read these words, in the year that King Uzziah died. And what we're going to find is that Isaiah opens up a vision of a true king priest, the real Messiah of Israel, sitting upon a throne, his priestly garments filling the house of God, surrounded by the glorified saints, spoken of as seraphim in the context. And all of that's picked up and taken into the New Testament, into Revelation chapter 4, as we're going to see. So this study of Uzziah has far-reaching consequences. And you're going to see just how far-reaching they are, God willing, in the few minutes that we have to canvass this story. So here are the times of Uzziah. During the reigns of Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam II of Israel, the divided kingdom enjoyed a period of great prosperity and relative peace. What happened was this, historically. The Assyrian kings, who were always a danger for hundreds of years, they were always pushing south, making life in Israel particularly, but certainly also in Judah, extremely uncomfortable. In this particular period, Yahweh gave victories over Syria, which was a very powerful kingdom at the time. He gave the victory to Israel because of the promise to Jehu, and that, of course, kept the Syrians quiet, but the Assyrian kings did not ever come down against the king of Syria at this time because they found him too difficult to overcome. So it was a period in which the angels were at work manipulating the nations to the north of Israel to give a period of peace and prosperity to God's people. Guess what they did with it? Well, of course, the people of Israel in the north did absolutely the wrong thing with it. And of course, for that, it wasn't very long after the end of Jehu's dynasty that the whole thing fell apart. And in 722 BC, the Assyrians came down and carted them all away, the last 28,000 of them. But in the south, it was a bit different. We're going to have a look at what was happening in the south during this period of peace and prosperity. Uzziah was an amazing man. Now, what I'm going to do, because of time, I'm not going to take you through verse by verse and word by word through the text that we've just read. I'm just going to point out the verses as we go through a catalogue of Uzziah's achievements. As a 16-year-old, the way I read the record, it could be a bit different if we're talking about co-regencies, but the way I read it, it says in verse 1 that after the death of his father Amaziah in rather ludicrous circumstances, the people of the land took Uzziah, who was only 16 years of age, and they made him king in the room of his father, and he built Elath, and restored it to Judah after the king slept with his fathers. Now, that may mean that as a 16-year-old he was out there on warlike campaigns. However you read that, the fact is that the Spirit wants us to have this as the first thing in the list of this catalogue of achievements. And we'll see the reason for that a little later on. So here is his first act. Then we read in verses 4 and 5 of this man's spiritual qualities. We read about his mother's name, of course, in that record as well. Have a look at verses 4 and 5. And he did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father Amaziah did. And he sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God. And as long as he sought Yahweh, God made him to prosper. Interesting the way that's framed, isn't it? The word God there, of course, we know as Elohim. And the most significant of the occurrences is the last one. So here was a young man, 16 when he came to the throne, who clearly in his teenage years set out to seek Yahweh his God with all of the diligence that he could muster. And he was helped in that venture by this man Zechariah. This is not, of course, the Zechariah we considered in our last study who was slain between the temple and the altar. Another Zechariah, a very prominent man. Now this man, it says, has understanding in the visions of God. The word visions there is the Hebrew word ra'ah. It means to see. And Rotherham translates it in the seeing of God. I'll tell you something, brothers and sisters, and especially young people. It's only when faith allows you to see God, that is to make a reality of him, that you start behaving yourself. You know what happens? You know what happens to most of us at some point in our lives? Our faith fades. For whatever reason, we get away from the Bible, whatever it might be, troubles come into our life, there's a plethora of reasons. Faith fails, and God becomes less of a reality than what he ought to be. Our behaviour changes. True? So it's very, very important that what happened to Uzziah happens to every one of our young people. You need to have a relationship with older brethren and sisters who can see God by faith. Brethren and sisters whose behaviour is consistent, who you look at and you know their unwavering faith tells you that they've got their head in their Bible. Build a relationship with them, young people. Find someone like that that you can trust, that you love spiritually. Find someone like that, because if they can help you to see God, then you're going to have success like this young man had, Uzziah. Hopefully it won't lead to the same end as him, but he had 40 years of unbelievable success. Why? Well, we're told in that verse 5. He's got the help of Zechariah in the seeing of God, and as long as he sought Yahweh, Elohim made him to prosper. What's that telling you? Well, the angels get involved in the workings of your everyday life. That's what happened. And if you got that happening in your life, you're going places. That's what it's telling you. And the place that you're going to happens to be called the kingdom of God. I'm going to talk a bit about that tonight as well. So this is a young man whose example is there for all of us to learn something from, especially our younger people. Well, this list goes on. He defeated the Philistines and subdued 3 of their cities, we were told, in verse 6. Now, we're going to see why this all happened in a moment. He waged a successful campaign against both the Arabians and the Mehunims, we read in verse 7. He put the Ammonites to tribute and became famous in Egypt, we find in verse 8. He fortified the walls and defences of Jerusalem against attack, we read in verse 9. So you're getting a bit of a picture? Now, this is all happens over about a period of 40 years. He does something else. He loved husbandry, agriculture, this man. He brought water to the dry wilderness and he promoted agriculture amongst his people. We're told that in verse 10. It says there at the end of the verse, for he loved husbandry. And if you have a look at the Hebrew, the word is Adamah. It means soil. Soil that you, of course, grow things in. As Rotherham says, a lover of the soil was he. So he loved gardening. And to garden in this dry land, a bit like the climate of South Australia, where I was born and raised, it's very dry in summertime, you need water. So he brought water into the desert. He also built a formidable army of 300,000 highly trained men. We read that, of course, in verse 11. We read of the captains that he put over that army. He built an arsenal of effective weapons of defence, verse 14 told us. He invented and built cunning engines of war in Jerusalem, we found in verse 15. But there was something else in verse 15, wasn't there? There's a second sentence in that verse. It says this: "And his name spread far abroad, for he was marvellously helped till he was strong. He became internationally famous for the success that he had. Decade after decade, all the nations around him were subdued. They feared him. His name went all over the place." Of course, it didn't have internet in those days, and there was no social media. So it had to be done by word of mouth. Shanks's pony. People would travel and they would talk. Have you heard about Uzziah, king of Judah? It's incredible what that man's doing. And so his name went everywhere. Why? Why was this happening? Well, end of verse 15. He was marvellously helped till he was strong. Now, there are 4 of those in this chapter. 4 of those indications, declarations of divine help. It's well worth just highlighting them if you do happen to have some kind of instrument to do that. Just highlight these 4 declarations of divine help. We read one of them, of course, in verse 4 and 5. As long as he sought Yahweh, Elohim made him to prosper. The second one was in verse 7. It says this: "And God helped him against the Philistines, etc." That's the clear indication that his victories were not won with his own strength. It was because the angels were there. The Elohim of verse 5 were there, ensuring success. And then we have in verse 8 another declaration. At the end of the verse it says, "For he strengthened himself exceedingly." And this is not a particularly good translation. On the screen we have the translation of Rotherham. Rotherham says, "For he showed exceeding great strength." It's saying, of course, that this was strength that was given to him. It's not his strength. It was the strength of the Elohim that were there working behind the scenes, ensuring the victories and the triumphs. And the 4th declaration, of course, is that one we've just read in verse 15. He was marvellously helped. Now that word marvellously there is the Hebrew word pala, P-A-L-A. It means to separate, hence to distinguish. So this was unique help. This has not been seen very often in the history of God's people. This is something that happened because of the quality of this man. Because he sought Yahweh, he prospered. You know what Paul wrote to Timothy? When he wrote to him, he said, "I want you to get your head in your Bible, Timothy. You get your head in your Bible and you focus on the doctrine. You focus on exhortation. Focus on the reading of the Word. You know what? Your profiting will appear to all." Now the word profiting there has nothing to do with gaining money. It's talking about progress. You will be seen to be pushing forward in the things that really count, Timothy. That's what was happening to Uzziah, the king of Judah. It is indeed a wonderful story of success. But isn't it sad that human life always has to have buts? It always happens, doesn't it? But look at the beginning of verse 16. But, come on, please. Can't we have a change? No. My experience in life is that when things seem to be going well and I seem to be making progress, there are always buts. But I didn't keep it up. But I didn't do my readings. But I didn't go to the meeting. You know what it's like, brothers and sisters and young people. We are but people, aren't we? Not boat people, but people. There are always buts. You can do something about that, you know. But, being human beings, we tend to mess it up. But let's just take the warning of that. If it happened to a man like this, it can happen to anybody. So you've got to be on your guard. You know, success can go to your head, can't it? It went to this man's head. Even if that success came from God's blessing, he forgot that. He forgot where his blessings came from. So verse 16 is a tragic thing, isn't it, when it says, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. That's not what God wanted to achieve in this man's life. The word there, lifted up, is the Hebrew word gabar. It means to soar, to be lofty. He was soaring in the things that really counted. And now he was going to go down to destruction and probably won't be in the kingdom of God. For he transgressed against Yahweh his God. He went into the temple to burn incense upon the altar of incense. And we know the story, we read it. He goes in there and he's chased in there by 80 priests, at the head of which is the high priest of the day, a man called Azariah, whom he wants to displace. And he's told that he doesn't belong in there. This is not his domain. Under the law of God, he shouldn't be in here. And he gets very angry, and while the priests are communicating amongst themselves as to what they're going to do with this very wrathful king who won't listen to them, some very, very interesting things happen. I want to give you what Josephus tells us about what happens. Now, we can't always rely upon Josephus, but I'm going to suggest that perhaps he's got some of this right. When you read the text, I think he's got some of it right. Uzziah's assumption. What I want to do now is to present some contrast a bit later on between Uzziah and Christ, of course. Just have a look at what this is pointing to. You know, it's an interesting story, and you can read it every year in your readings and think, yeah, very interesting story. This has got huge ramifications, not only for the work of Christ, but for the nation of modern Israel, as we shall see. Huge ramifications. So let's go through them. His pretension. Josephus records that Uzziah entered the temple on a special feast day to offer incense on behalf of the nation. True? Maybe. But what we do know is this, that Christ offered himself unspotted to God on a special feast day. Yes, it was the Passover, on behalf of all mankind. Josephus says that he threatened the priests with death. No wonder they had turned around to discuss what they're going to do next. I'll show you in a minute. They did turn around. They were actually talking, these 80 priests. Imagine 80 priests in the holy place. I mean, there would hardly be any standing room, would there? 80 priests. And of course, Uzziah is up against the veil, about to offer incense on the altar of incense. This is a pretty crowded place. And they're turned away and they're discussing what they're going to do with this angry monarch behind them, who will not listen. Well, things are going to happen. So Josephus says he threatened them with death. Christ, of course, was crucified by the demand of the priests. Josephus records that an earthquake split the temple, admitting a ray of light that illuminated Uzziah's leprous forehead. Now, we know that there was an earthquake in the days of Uzziah, don't we? Because Amos prophesied 2 years before the earthquake. We know that there was an earthquake. It may well have happened on this occasion. What we also know is that there was an earthquake that accompanied the splitting of the veil of the temple when Christ died. And the way into the most holy was opened for him. Uzziah was smitten with leprosy, living death, for the rest of his days. Graves were opened at Christ's death, and he himself 3 days later arose, of course, to everlasting life, also accompanied by earthquake, as you will recall. So there's a sharp contrast being made here between this man who thought he could be Messiah and the real Messiah. Now let's just stop there for a second. I'll just go back to the point we made. Why would this man be motivated to grasp hold of the high priesthood? He was already king. Well, you see, he got to the point after 40 years of unmitigated success, when everything went well, when the nation was prosperous, nobody touched them. God was clearly at work in the nation. He got to the point when he asked the simple question, when Messiah cometh, will he do greater works than this man? His answer was no. But he knew, he was an intelligent Bible student, He knew that the Messiah of Israel was both a king and a priest. He knew from Melchizedek that Melchizedek was a king priest. He knew that Jehoiada had been buried amongst the kings, whereas his father and grandfather had not. Jehoiada was effectively a king priest. So why shouldn't he be a king priest? If Messiah won't achieve any more than what I've achieved, why shouldn't I be a king priest? To him it was all over. It was as simple as that. And God's going to make sure that this man goes away knowing that that was utterly wrong. So he becomes a leper. Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death because of an act of betrayal against his God and against his people. Whereas on the other hand, when the true Messiah came, when he came to perform his work on a special feast day, at the moment of his betrayal by one of his own disciples, the king of the Jews healed a man called Malchus. Hebrew, Melchi, just happens to mean king. Malchus, the servant of the high priest. See the point? There are sharp contrasts being made. Uzziah's selfish claim to the high priesthood was repudiated by infliction with leprosy, whereas Christ's claim to the high priesthood was demonstrated by his compassion to those who were out of the way, and even to the man who had his ear lopped off by Peter in the garden. Uzziah dwelt in a house apart. Just cast your eyes down to 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 21. It says this: And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and he dwelt in a several house, being a leper. Now that word several is a Hebrew word that means to spread out or to loosen. So Rotherham translates it this way: he dwelt in a house apart. Now it's very important. That translation is very good. It's very important to take those words on board, as you'll see in a moment. He dwelt in a house apart. It's going to happen again very soon to the people that Uzziah came to represent in the divine prophetic scheme. It's a very, very curious overturning of this man's pretension. Uzziah the leper was never healed of leprosy. He died with it. So he never had the high priest touch his right ear with the blood of the sacrifice from the trespass offering that was made if a leper was ever cleansed. Leviticus 14 verse 14. They brought along certain animals, and the blood of the trespass offering was put on the leper's right ear as part of the cleansing process. That never happened to Uzziah, but it did happen to Malchus, didn't it? Christ touched the right ear of Malchus, whose name means the king, and healed him, thus signifying his power to cure the problem of leprosy. The leprous king was found at the end of his days lying in state for an obscure burial in what we saw was the field of burial, where the lesser kings were buried. Whereas Christ as king and high priest is seen in Isaiah chapter 6, and we'll go to that a little later on. In Isaiah chapter 6 verses 1 to 8, he is seen as a king priest, very much alive, living forever, sitting in the temple, there in the company of his saints in glory. What a contrast that is. And death claims the son of David, dismissed from the throne and rejected from the priesthood he so presumptuously sought, while Christ appears in glory with his glorified saints, called the seraphim, in Isaiah chapter 6, who are kings and priests with him and share his throne. It's quite a remarkable story. I want you to come now to Isaiah 6. I'm going to do this before I get into the last part, because this is where you and I are personally involved in these things. Isaiah chapter 6 begins with words that appear to follow an earthquake. You just cast your eyes back to verse 25 of Isaiah 5. It says this: Therefore is the anger of Yahweh kindled against his people. He has stretched forth his hand against them and has smitten them. And the hills, did tremble, and their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. It's the language of an earthquake. And we get down to chapter 6 and verse 1, it says this: in the year that King Uzziah died. I wonder why it would start that way. Well, it can only be that because of contrast. There's a sharp contrast being made between the leper king, it's been laid to rest in the times of Isaiah, and the king whom he is portraying here, the true Messiah of Israel in glory. That's the reason for that, in the year that King Uzziah died. He goes on to say this: I saw also, it says, the Lord. Now this is one of the 134 occasions where the Sophorim altered Yahweh to Adonai. So you can safely change that to Yahweh. It should read, I saw also Yahweh, he who will become, sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Now the word train here is the word used in the Old Testament for the high priest's garments. So here we've got a king, because he's sitting on a throne, so he's a king. And he's dressed in the high priest's garments. So he's a king priest. Where is he? He's in the temple. Where did Uzziah want to go? Well, he was in the temple, but he was kicked out. So the sharp contrast is being drawn. So who does this refer to here? You just need to keep something in Isaiah 6 and come over to John chapter 12. Let the scripture interpret this for us. John chapter 12, and we'll begin at verse 39. Verse 39 says, therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said again, he hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. Just stop there. All of that verse, verse 40, all of it is quoted from Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 10, 9 and 10. All right? All of it. So John is in Isaiah chapter 6. He makes that quote from Isaiah 6. He goes on to say this in John 12, in verse 41. These things said Isaiah when he saw his, now the his of the context here is Christ, when he saw Christ's glory and spake of him. So you don't need to argue. Isaiah 6 is all about the glory of Christ in the future as king and priest in the house of God. It's that simple. So we come back to Isaiah 6 and we've seen the king, now we see ourselves. Verse 2. Above it stood the seraphim. Seraphim means burning, to be on fire, because these individuals as a community are a judgment community. They're the ones who are going to establish the kingdom through divine judgment upon the earth. They're on fire, it says in Revelation chapter 10. Pillars of fire which march through the earth over 40 years. That's why the symbol of fire is used. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, that is, with 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. Now, you go to Ezekiel chapter 1, it's 4 wings. So why are these seraphim here got 6 wings? Well, you see, if there are 4 of them, like there are in the cherubim, 4 living creatures, and they each have 6 wings, what does that mean? How many wings? 24. What's 24 the number of? Well, it's the number of the priesthood. You can go back and have a look at what David set up. When he set up the Levites and the priesthood, 24 is stamped all over it. 24 courses. 24 orders. So 24 is the number of the priesthood. So here we've got a symbol for king, priest. You see that for a moment? But let's just read on in Isaiah 6, verse 3. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. So it's clearly in the kingdom age. So why holy, holy, holy? Well, you see, the temple and the tabernacle before it had 3 courts, didn't they? There was the outer court, where there was a sacrificial order. There was the holy place, into which Uzziah went with incense, you'll remember. And what was his intention when he became high priest? He was going to go into the most holy on the Day of Atonement as high priest. He only got to the second court. He got kicked out of it because he was unholy in his thinking. He's struck with leprosy in his forehead, and the forehead represents your thinking. So his thinking was corrupt. And the record actually says in 2 Chronicles 20:26, we'll go back to the moment, that it shot forth to reveal the state of this man's thinking. So he's kicked out. And he goes back through the outer court, outside to a separate house, to a house apart. But these people are with their king, and they access all 3 courts. You know where you're going, brothers and sisters and young people, if you're in the kingdom? You know where you're going? You're going to walk up Mount Zion. You're going to serve at the altar on the top of Mount Zion. And from the inner gates of the circular sanctuary inwards is the most holy. It's the 3rd holy. So we're going to access 3 holies. I tell you, who won't be there? Uzziah, king of Judah. Now this is a very important context. But, there's always a but, isn't there? Read on. Verse 5. Then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips. Unclean lips? Yes. In Leviticus 13, verses 40 to 46, if you had leprosy in your forehead and your thinking is corrupt, you were declared a leper. You were wholly unclean. And you went around crying out with your beard covered, unclean, unclean. Twice, because that's the number of division. And Isaiah looked at himself and said, I saw Christ in glory, and I saw his saints in glory. But look at me. I'm a leper. We're all lepers. But you can be cleansed of leprosy. And Isaiah is, verse 6. He says, I'm a man of unclean, mine eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of armies. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me. One of the seraphims? Yes. You know what that's saying to us, brothers and sisters? If you can build a picture of the future that is so real that you can see yourself there, it's going to change the way you live your life. Because you'll want to be there. It's when you lose sight of it, you've got problems, isn't it? So one of the seraphims, I believe that when that seraphim came to Isaiah, Isaiah looks at him and says, hey, you're my brother. You know, you've seen those silly booper ads? Getting a healthier you? Seen them? Just been down holidays to the Gold Coast, they're all over the place. Well, he saw himself. Go on, verse 6. Then flew one of the seraphims having a live coal in his hand. This is from the altar of sacrifice. He takes up the tongue from the altar. He lays it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin is purged. In other words, this man, like you and I, is related to the sacrifice of Christ. That's removed. The problem that stands between him and eternal life. Verse 8. Also I heard the voice of Yahweh, as it should read in verse 8 again, saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. I want you to come to Revelation 4. Because Revelation 4, brothers and sisters and young people, is drawn, all of it, from that context in Isaiah 6. There's a throne, and upon it is sitting a king, who's also a priest. And around him he's got 4 living creatures, the saints in their kingly role, administrative role, judgment role. And there are 24 elders on thrones around him. 24? Yes. That's why these people sing in chapter 5 and at verse 10, "Thou hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth." 4 living creatures, kings. 24 elders, priests. Look at the language of verse 8. "And the 4 living creatures had each of them," this is chapter 4, verse 8 of the Apocalypse, "each of them had 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come." Yeah, that's all drawn out of Isaiah chapter 6. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because we want to go back and deal with what is not as an important subject, but also is important. So come back now to 2 Chronicles 26. And we'll push on. Isaiah was denied access to any court of God's house. Holy, 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 as we've seen, reveals that Christ had access to all the house, as you and I will. The leprous king is buried without apparent hope, while Isaiah is cured of his leprosy by personal identification with the multitudinous Christ. But this is the matter I want to deal with at the end of our study tonight. Isaiah's reign is a type of modern Israel. This man who wanted to become Messiah, who was a marvellous type of Messiah, by pretension ends up becoming a type of the modern nation of Israel. Now, those of you who haven't heard that before, and there'll be many of you who have, might be surprised by that. It's true, as you're going to see. So let's go through the catalogue of modern Israel's latter-day achievements. 1956. They captured Elath in the Sinai campaign. Turned it into a trading city. It's also a tourist city today as well. They captured the Shephelah and the Negev in their campaigns against the Philistines, Palestinians. That's where Palestine comes from Philistine. They defeated the Arabs and Jordanians in battle, 56. Well, let's go back earlier. 49, 48, 49, 56, 67, 73. They fortified Jerusalem against attack in the late 1960s and early 70s. You had to get approval before you could build a building in Jerusalem. It had to withstand nuclear warfare, if that's possible. And Israel, of course, built a prosperous agricultural society. The world today has learnt from the Jews as to how to grow vegetables in the desert. That's what Uzziah did. Providing water supplies with their great water carrier and many other ways and means. You know, when you go out and buy agriculture, buy that irrigation stuff, you know, the black plastic, you put out a pipe and screw something into it and it sprays onto your garden. Guess where that came from? Yeah, the Jews. Israel developed a powerful army of 300,000 fighting men. That's the size of their army when it needs to be put together to fight their battles. Israel became a leader in missile warfare. Ever seen any clips of the 1967 Six-Day War when they wiped out the Egyptian Air Force in the first couple of hours of the war? Guided bombs. Hey, never heard of before. I mean, it's nothing today, but in 1967, that was fantasy world. But they did it. When they took possession in the 1970s of aircraft, fighting aircraft, from the Americans, they took the American missiles up and put their own on. They're much better. They just happen to be the leading technology nation in the world today. You know, You look down this list of Uzziah's achievements, it exactly matches the list of modern Israel's achievements. Could you argue that they haven't been helped by God? Well, of course they've been helped by God, just like Uzziah was. But, like him, they finally attributed their success to their own strength and the power of their own arm. And they're going to be humbled soon by an earthquake, as we'll see in a moment. And they're going to dwell in houses apart, like their king, Uzziah. And they're going to have to be washed clean of leprosy, which Uzziah never was. That's why he died. And in the year that the latter-day King Uzziah dies, when the nation with its current pride and pretentiousness is cleansed, then they're going to see their king in glory. Israel, in fact, claims to be the Messiah today. Did you know that? Barbara Tuchman, who wrote a book, a very good book by the way, called Bible and Sword, she died in 2003, she was a Jewish historian, said this: "Not until they came to perceive, beginning in the 1860s, that they would have to act as their own Messiah, did the return to Israel actually become realisable." Heinrich Graetz, another historian, wrote in 1864, "The Jewish people must be their own Messiah." When a Christadelphian group toured the land in 1970, amongst them was my uncle, they spoke to Rabbi Abrahams in Jerusalem. He was the head rabbi at the time. This is 3 years after the dramatic, almost miraculous victory of 1967. They asked him, he's a religious man, he's the head of the Jewish religion in Jerusalem. They said, "Are you in expectation of Messiah?" His answer was, "We are the Messiah." We, the nation of Israel, is the Messiah. That's why, brothers and sisters, they have to go through this. So come with me now to Zechariah chapter 14. We're very familiar with this particular passage because we hope to be there when verse 4 is fulfilled. "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives." If you look at the end of verse 5, it says he doesn't come alone. It says, "And Yahweh my God shall come, and all the saints, the Kodesh, the holy ones, with him." So we hope to be there when these things come to pass. So what will happen? Look at verse 5. "And ye, the Jews," because Israel is the subject of this prophecy, have a look at verses 1 and 2. "Ye shall flee, not to, but from the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach very near," as it should be rendered. "Yea, ye shall flee, like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah." I wonder why it's the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. Well, because the nation today is like King Uzziah. They think they are Messiah. Just like he thought he was Messiah. Had to be humbled. Like he was humbled by an earthquake to reveal their leprosy. So when they're declared lepers, what do you do then? Well, Uzziah lived in a house apart. Turn back to chapter 12. Verses 12 to 14. When he presents himself to them and someone says to him, "What are these wounds in your hands?" He said, "These are the wounds I received in the house of my friends." "Did you?" "Yes." "And they will mourn for him as a man mourns for his only one," it says in verse 10. Verse 12 says, "And the land shall mourn, every family apart. The family of the house of David apart, and their wives apart. The family of the house of Nathan apart." And you know, it goes on like that. You know how many times the word apart is used in the Hebrew? 11. And 11 is the number of failure. So what do you do when you realise you've got leprosy and you want to be freed from it? You want to be cleansed from it. And you are cleansed. What happened to a leper when he's cleansed? Well, he had to make certain sacrifices and he had to wash his whole body in water. Have a look at Zechariah 13 verse 1. In that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. There was no worse uncleanness under the law of Moses than leprosy. So these people, having dwelt in houses apart, will seek cleansing. Uzziah didn't go through that process. But you and I, brothers and sisters, have. If we're baptised, we've been through that process. And we ought to be ready for the fulfilment of the wonderful things that we've seen just briefly this evening. Because Israel's king priest will soon come. Hosea 3, 4 and 5 declares that. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king. That's happened. Without a prince. Without a sacrifice since AD 70. Without an image. Without an ephod, no priest. Without teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek Yahweh their God and David their king, namely Christ, and shall fear Yahweh and his goodness in the latter days. We have the wonderful privilege of being involved in their cleansing, of going through convincing them, just like the priests tried to do back in the days of Uzziah, that they are leprous and they need to be cleansed. But in the meantime, brothers and sisters, we need to do that amongst ourselves. We need to make sure that we can see God and that we can pass that on as best we can, especially to our younger people in these deadly days in which we're living. Because this is going to soon happen. Won't be long. And the latter day King Uzziah will die. And the true Messiah will appear. And you and I will be there, and we will see this magnificent man, this Son of God, the Son of David, King in Jerusalem, in the house of Yahweh, King priest, his priestly garments filling the temple. But he won't be alone. He will be there in the Holy of Holies with the seraphim, with the 24 elders. That's the vision. Israel's great king priest with the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders who sing, Thou hast made us unto our God, kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. And I believe there's no doubt that among them will be Jehoiada, the priest, his faithful wife, the daughter of David, Jehoiada, whose name means whose oath is Yahweh, and their son, born with a title to the priesthood and a title to the princehood of Israel. King priest in prospect, so to speak, Zechariah, whose name means Yah hath remembered, he will remember them. And there'll be another man there who thought he was unclean and couldn't make it. But a coal is brought to him by a seraphim, probably with his face, saying, you can get there. If this coal touches your lips and you are willing, here I am, he said. Send me. How about we make that our New Year's resolution? If you make them. The world does, and they don't keep them. They don't even remember them. How about we make a resolution? 2013 is probably going to be our last year. How about we make the resolution? Here I am. Send me.